So we are going to get started. People will continue to join us. I just want to welcome everybody on behalf of John and myself and our co-hosts, Carolin Copeland in Munich, who is Sebastian's wonderful, fabulous wife, and Matt Petersen here in Los Angeles. And of course, Sebastian himself, our friend and honored guest. We also want to thank Chevalier's Books, located here in Los Angeles, for organizing this event with us. Chevalier's is an independent bookstore owned by our longtime friends, Bert Deixler and Leslie Swain. So thank you. And also a shout out to Teresa Fung of Chevalier's, who did all the legwork. We're here to celebrate the publication of Sebastian Copeland's stunning new book, Antarctica, The Waking Giant. And it couldn't be a better time with President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, two American leaders who believe in science and will take immediate action on the climate crisis. So here we are. Not only are you joining us from our hometown of Los Angeles, but also, as you can tell from the chat, many other places in the United States and in Europe. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, let us know where you're coming in from, because I think it's really exciting. And I think for us, this is a true indication of the global draw of Sebastian's work as a polar explorer and photographer who's captured the haunting beauty of the seventh continent, and as a scientist who pairs his images with analysis to help us understand the urgency of the climate crisis. So quick note about the program. After I do a quick intro of Sebastian, he's going to hopefully share a brief video, if that works. And then he and John will be in conversation, including some of the images. John's then going to moderate Q&A with the guests. So please put your questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. And of course, keep talking to us and each other through the chat. We'll post the Chevalier's link a few times where you can buy Sebastian's book during the event, because in addition to listening to Sebastian's compelling stories, we are also here to buy his book. We need to help Sebastian keep doing his important work. For our European friends, Chevalier's does not ship overseas, but you can find Antarctica online and in fine bookstores. In 2017, Sebastian Copeland was named one of the world's top 25 adventurers of the past 25 years. Noted as a photographer who has produced works that are of outstanding artistic merit and communicate messages of urgent global significance, Sebastian has led numerous expeditions to document the endangered polar regions, covering more than 6,000 miles on skis over the ice. Since 2001, he has warned of systemic transformations taking place in the polar regions and their geoeconomic consequences. Sebastian has addressed audiences at the United Nations and at other institutions and governments globally, as well as with Fortune 500 companies, about the urgent need for a market transformation towards a sustainable economy. Sebastian is a fellow of the renowned Explorers Club in New York and a member of the International Glaciology Society. His books have sold in over 70 countries, and he has twice been named Photographer of the Year by the prestigious International Photography Association for his polar work, both in 2007 and this year for his current book. Sebastian received the 2018 Bambi Award in Germany in the Our Earth category. And last year, French President Emmanuel Macron awarded Sebastian France's National Order of Merit. Leo DiCaprio, who wrote the book's foreword, pleads that if we lose the Antarctic ice, we lose a piece of our soul, and it won't be long before the body follows as it drowns in Earth's tears. Sebastian's Antarctica, The Waking Giant, shows a frozen landscape with a scale and light that tell the tale of a critical ecosystem that will fast slip away without enormous global action. And with that, Sebastian, Thank you so much for joining us today. I turn it over to you and John.
Well, Kim, first of all, thank you so very much. I know there's one person who's online who will be very proud of this amazing introduction, and that's my mother. I'm pretty sure she's listening. So thank you, John and Kim. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. It might end up being a decidedly low-tech event, as I'm having a challenge putting the images up, but there's lots to say regardless. So, you know, you and John and I were together, I think the last time when Ruth Bader Ginsburg left us, and there was certainly a lot of uncertainty as that was going to impact the course of the election. And as we stand here a few months later, we can all, I think, you know, exhale a little bit at least, because the environment, I think, is the clear winner of this 2020 election. But let's jump into Antarctica, since I'm pretty sure that's what a lot of you are interested in. So far away.
Well, Sebastian, you have, first of all, thanks so much for joining us. And I will say one of the great pleasures of the last couple of years has been getting to know you and Caro and our growing friendship. And so we're just so excited we could do this and hopefully sell some books as well. You've committed 20 years of your life to the polar regions. How on earth did you decide to start exploring the ice? And what do you find so compelling about it?
You know, the ice is the last dominion on our planet, where we get to experience what life might have been like long before we got here. You know, 650 years ago, the Earth was entirely covered in ice, and we call it the snowball ice, the snowball Earth, that is. And traveling in the polar regions is literally like being the last human on Earth. And for those of us who are into that kind of experience, you know, there's nothing like it. It, you know, it has all types of challenges, both external and internal, but it is also remarkably powerful in the sense that, you know, nature exists with or without us. And I think there is no place quite like the ice to remind us of that, because particularly on the Antarctica plateau, it's an environment that is entirely void of life. And so it just exists in this sort of state of you know, this physicality that is so brutal and so powerful. And we get to really readjust, if you will, the scale of humanity within that relationship with nature. And I find that very compelling.
You know, on a personal level, what do you take away from, and you were starting to touch on this a little bit, from immersing yourself in such a hostile environment for such a long period of time? I mean, I don't know if people understand, you are literally months on the ice. You are, you weigh a lot less when you come out of this than when you go into it. How does that change you as a person? And how does it perhaps shape your perspective on life?
You know, that's a great question, John, because the nature of these extremely antagonistic environments will invariably change you. And the way that it starts is pretty brutal. Being on the ice has a propensity to really take you down to the studs in terms of your mental and emotional wherewithal. I don't care how well prepared you are, what your level of experience is. There's not a single explorer out there who engages in a you know, legitimate full-on expedition. And by that, I mean, it's going to be multiple weeks, multiple months, you know, sometimes in excess of 3 months. And in pretty much in complete autonomy. So relying exclusively on what you've brought with you. And, you know, there's no question that the first few days of that experience is going to be a WF, you know, a WTF moment. And, you know, I'm too old for this as ... And getting hit by this onslaught of physical brutality, which is a deep freeze with temperatures regularly in excess of 30, 40, 50 below. This is without windshield. So with the windshield, that can really drop down to 60, 70, 80, 90 below. And it takes a little while to start to find yourself within that environment. And generally, at first, what it does is it takes you down. And instead of having this big lofty goal of accomplishing either a world first or, being able to, to claim this grandiose crossing of the continent, you end up hoping that you'll make it through the next day. And therein becomes the internal expedition of putting just one foot in front of the other and hoping for the best. And progressively, this is what builds you into that new character that will essentially exit on the other side of that mission. And this will be the new you. And it's a very, very powerful, very privileged experience to be having. And the attraction is that I think you invariably end up redoing the world in the image that you wish it were, at a level that is perhaps easier to achieve, remaking yourself in the image that you hope to be, recognizing your weaknesses. And of course, there's always this, this rehabilitation process when you re-enter, and the world may in some ways disappoint you, but it's only upon yourself to meet the expectations that you set, or at least the dream that you had while you were on the ice.
It's funny. I watched an episode of The Crown last night, and it was Prince Philip, who was so taken with the Apollo 11 astronauts, and he desperately wanted to meet with them and talk about how did this change your life? What perspective did you have coming away from it? And his disappointment was they were just three young guys who were checking the box and going through their mission and executing their mission, but didn't seem to take anything away from that. Clearly, you are not like that. You clearly are taking much away from this, certainly from a personal standpoint and just from a perspective on life. Do you find re-entry hard when you come back into the real world, so to speak, or maybe the unreal world, since you've been in the real world?
So I think the analogy to the moon is a good one, since it's always been a dream of mine, and it remains to go there. Wouldn't that be something? But the closest you get to the moon, as I said earlier, terrestrially, is really to visit these big bodies of ice, Antarctica, Greenland, and to some extent the Arctic Sea as well. But the re-entry, as you refer to it, is definitely a process. You end up living in this very binary world where there is just air and frozen water, and you exist in virtual isolation. So there is nothing to confront you with the sights, the smells, the sounds, the moods, the conflicts, and whatnot. It's purely just trying to find that Zen or that meditative balance within yourself. To, there's a good analogy that you probably will recall that movie, The Matrix, when the character of Keanu Reeves ends up sort of, having those bullets pass by him. And I don't purport to say that, that you end up with extra special, magical skills, but you do end up being able to dodge some of the big storms or some of the big challenges. In the north, there may be the wildlife that you encounter, and by that I mean the furry kind, or in Antarctica and in Greenland, maybe the crevasses and whatnot. And so that there are some high notes, but generally speaking, it's you're like a stain on a canvas. It's just a big empty space with within millions of square miles, where you're you, and if you have a partner, you and your partner, which in Antarctica I had, there were two of us, to make that clear. my friend and partner on a couple of expeditions, Eric McNair Landry. And but you know, at the end of the day, you're spending most of the time alone. You're not walking, having a shinwag with your partner. If you're doing a kite skiing mission, which was the case in Antarctica, there's great distances that can separate you if the weather is clear. When there's, you know, a storm and visibility gets down, you end up getting closer with one another. But either way, you're not exchanging much. Little bit in the morning, little bit in the evening, but generally speaking, you're pretty tired, and downtown in the tent is just to eat and sleep. So it's very, very much an eternal meditation for the, you know, the 60, 80 or 100 and some days that you're out there.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of speaking of that, or to maybe make it a little more specific for folks, what was the toughest experience you've had, either in Antarctica or with the furry kind, as you put it, in up north? And what was the most, if there is a most, the most rewarding or exhilarating experience that you had on these explorations?
That's a great question. I think, interestingly enough, the best and the worst live in such close proximity. And without sort of making any poetic hyperboles about it, you do operate in this suspended reality. And the fact that it is challenging is almost not worth mentioning. By definition, it is challenging, otherwise you wouldn't be there. It's cold, it's foreboding. Storms can be very powerful. You experience hurricane strength conditions, and the only thing that separates you from oblivion is a thin nylon tent, which, by the way, says a lot about human ingenuity, because, you know, it does withhold 80, 90 mile per hour winds.
It's on.
And on the ice, you do feel very, very exposed. You know, but the best is, it's almost the apotheosis of recognizing how immense, how powerful, and how, you know, the external natural forces are, and environment is, and how small and insignificant we are. So, riffing a little bit back to some of what you were asking earlier about the reentry, is, you know, you're always confronted with that dichotomous relationship between how insignificant you were out there and how self-important it seems that we all are out here. And it's not an innocent statement, in the sense that we've managed to create a little envelope where we stuff all our bills, and this is all where most of the problems go to. You know, where does this energy comes from? Where does water comes from? You know, where does the trash go? All of these principles that on the ice are fundamental. If you leave one little thing on the ice, it ruins the view. So you always take everything back with you. You know exactly where your fuel and your power comes from, and you're very aware of how much you spend. All of these metrics are lost to to the convenience of modern societies, of course, because we've done a great job at generating a world that shields us from our individual footprint. I think this is something that when you come back, you're acutely aware. And aside from adjusting to the tailpipes and the sounds and the community and everything else, one of the greater, I think, philosophical dimension is to just understand that we are so disconnected from our footprint that the world is in decay around us because of us, primarily because we're disconnected from that footprint. And this is one of the great lessons that you get, by the way, not just on the ice. I'm sure many outdoors people who are perhaps watching would experience the same thing. You're acutely aware that in the end, you're not in this sort of, very convenient urban environment, but that nature is right there and is giving you the privilege to exchange.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and it's important for us to understand. Just thinking about those of us who've never been there, certainly never been there in the way that you've been there. I think that we have a lot of friends who are actually traveling to Antarctica. When you're talking to people around the world about your experiences, is there one thing about Antarctica in particular that surprises people the most? Something that they have least expected to hear?
Sure. I mean, there's a list. I mean, the first, of course, is that most people think of the ice as an inanimate object, and it's everything but. Even on a massive ice sheet that is like Antarctica, ice is always on the move. It's never an inanimate, static matter. So, ice is essentially water in frozen form, but it responds to the same gravitational forces, meaning that if there is a slope, it'll go down, it pulled by the same gravitational forces that pulls water down, except it does it a lot slower. And what's interesting is that the ice sheet is moving constantly at a very, very slow pace. And then when it reaches the edge of the continent and starts to make its way downhill, then it transforms into what we call glaciers. And those glaciers start to move faster, and in moving faster, gravity pulls them and they start to crack, generating crevasses. And then finally, they may end up either as ice shells floating over the ocean and eventually breaking into icebergs, or sometimes if a glacier has no ice shelves, breaking directly into ice shelves and thereby entering the final phase of its life cycle. So what I find interesting about the ice, I never think about it in geology, you've got rocks that are, this sort of geological aspect of these minerals are very, very different, in my opinion, to what ice is. I call ice the fifth element. And in many ways, what I've come to look at into the ice is a cycle that is not altogether unlike our own. Ice is formed, it interacts, it travels, and eventually it breaks away into its final phase until it melts, which you could say it does with while it weeps towards its sort of final phase of life. And then eventually, in the same way that life has a cycle of inclusiveness, evaporation will create a hydrology that will redeposit that moisture back onto the ice sheet, and that process will start again. In Buddhism, we look often at that cycle from the standpoint that there is no end to anything, that it's always a reprocess. And for me, the ice, and particularly icebergs, because icebergs define that final character of the ice, and I find them always really interesting to photograph. And I have to apologize to all of you viewing this today. We did a rehearsal yesterday, and in sharing the screen, I had all my files in front of me. Today in sharing screen, I'm having all kinds of different things that are not giving me access to the documents that I've prepared for you assiduously today, but you'll just have to take my word for it. Icebergs are remarkably beautiful, completely individualistic. They no two are alike, and most likely no two will be essentially the same within just a few days. Even the same iceberg will not look the same within just a few days. So it's always very fun. That's great. Thank you. That's what we call low tech.
Well, we could also maybe send your video afterwards to everybody that registered, and a couple of images. That's easy to do.
Yes.
Yeah, I got a question for you. You've been to the North Pole, you've been to the South Pole. You didn't get there with a helicopter dropping you in. You have to be one of the few people on the planet who's not only been to both, but got there the hard way by walking or skiing or kite, surfing or whatever. So what's the difference? What do you see as the, and we get, there's obviously it's only ice in the North Pole and it's a landmass in the South, but talk to us a little bit about the differences, and we'll promise not to call you bipolar.
Okay. You would be the first one to do so, but of course, the geological differences are defining to these two environments. One is an ocean surrounded by continents. The other is a continent surrounded by ocean, and by definition, one is just, a few inches to a few feet of ice that forms over the ocean, and the other one has accumulated over the course of the last 45.5 million years or so, layers upon layers of ice, which, to give a very brief geological sort of background on it, Gondwana broke from Pangaea as a landmass, and about 160 million years ago, it broke from Africa, started to push south and generate the landmass, which is now Antarctica. So North Pole is up here, Antarctica is down there. And, over the course of the last 45.5 million years or so, it's, generated the cooling down. And so initially it had vegetation and whatnot, but progressively those layers started accumulating. The coolness was self-fulfilling in many ways, and progressively all the vegetation, or most of it at the very least, all the trees, ended up being covered by the layers of ice, who now have a thickness of about 2 miles, or some 3 and some kilometers. So the ice mass of Antarctica is just enormous. You have an extraordinary amount of frozen H2O that is sort of sitting there, pushing, gravity, if you were to invert it, of course, it feels more, mentally clear. But, let's reverse the poles for 1 second. The gravity is just the same, sits in the center. And all of this mass is crushing the land below it. And so what most people would not really know about Antarctica, which I find quite fascinating, is that, it's the highest elevations of the ice as a plateau is around 12,200 feet or so. But the reality is the thickness can be much, much greater than that, because there are inverted mountains below the ice in Antarctica that literally bring an extra 8,000 or 8,500 feet or so. So you have all this mass of ice on top, and the ice has crushed the land below it, creating basically these big inverted mountains. So long story short, it's a lot of ice. And most people don't necessarily understand that it's quite elevated. So traveling across it, I did a 2,500-mile crossing from east to west. It was the first crossing of its kind, unsupported and whatnot. One of the things that most people might not realize is that the air is thin. You're starting to move up in the atmosphere, and so oxygen gets compressed, and it's not just cold, but it's also thin in air. So you're sucking on air just to tie your shoelaces.
I'll tell you, for having skied at 12,000 feet, I get that. Here, just a couple more pictures I want to show. This is amazing. This looks like almost a frozen wave. And then, of course, we got this little guy. But let's move to climate change, Sebastian, and ask a couple of questions there. And then Kimberly and I are going to toggle back and forth with some of the questions that have come in from the audience. But how does your photography help to make the case for compelling action on climate change?
Well, another great question here. So I went to college and did. I've always been very curious, and I've studied a variety of different things. Geology was high on my list, and particularly astronomy and glaciology. But I ended up. I was photographing, and I had a good eye for it. My grandfather was a very avid safari photographer. Grew up in India. And as a surgeon, and was initially a hunter, but gave up his weapon for a camera in midlife after having shot I don't think over 30 tigers, as I am aware of, and a bunch of bears, and it's quite embarrassing. But by midlife, this is what you did, I suppose, in those days, and unaware of the devastation that this was generating on the wildlife. But he traded his gun in midlife and started to get really enamored with safaris, and did some both in West Bengal, but then also in Africa and Tanzania and Botswana. And he settled himself in Swaziland. When I was a kid, I started going down there, and I did my first safaris with him with a camera. I was about 11, 12 years old. And that's when I started taking photos. And honestly, photography is not something that I chose. It's really more something that I feel chose me. And so to a large extent, it was always an appendage to me in terms of an extension of what I did. And since I was into extreme sports and mountaineering and climbing and always dreamt of being a polar explorer, it's always something that I had with me. And in college, I was taking photographs, and they were good enough that I got hired even while I was in college to start working commercially. And rather than go for a PhD, I ended up sort of moving away from academia, which I still love. I did 2 majors, and went on to be a commercial photographer for some time, until the interest for me wore thin. It was very fun, very exciting at many levels, and a great learning experience, but it simply didn't meet some requirements that I wanted to enrich my own intellect and personal development. And so I had the opportunity to go and explore the Arctic regions, and there were a few experiences that led me to push my boundaries further and further until I became basically a sponsored athlete in my mid-30s. And I had always been an athlete, and this is where it went. My camera was essentially an extension of these places that I visited, and an extension of what I was able to do both as an explorer and as an athlete, but also as an advocate. One of the reasons I left the commercial world is because in the mid-90s, I was made acutely aware of the issues surrounding climate change, and they very much resonated to some of the topics that I had studied in college. And it all sort of made sense that I would be much better satisfied moving into those fields. So my camera I had a facility for generating emotions with the camera. It's a tool that I perfected professionally, but I was mostly gifted with. And I wanted to apply it to something that was bigger than selling things. And, or at least if it was going to sell things, it should sell concepts. And these concepts should be about, philosophical considerations. And to that extent, I look at climate and photography as a marketing exercise. For me, it's a weapon. My camera has been weaponized to communicate ideas about the anthropogenic footprint on these wild places. And so if you looked at my house, there are 3 pillars: athleticism, climate research, and photography, and they all work in concert, constantly sort of feeding onto one another.
Sebastian, we have a great related question from our friend Susie Perlman in Pittsburgh, whose daughter is a big photographer. She'd like you to address the challenges of filming and photographing with extreme conditions. Just perhaps a quick answer on that. Both temperature and major light reflections we know could be challenges. Technically, like, how do you do that? And can you see your work at night so you can review it before heading back out the next day?
Great questions. It depends. So the equipment mostly is subjected, of course, to extreme cold, and that primarily affects batteries. In some environments like Antarctica, you benefit from power charging because you're in the austral summer, as opposed to the boreal winter, which is where you travel generally in the North Pole. So Antarctica, the sun is, at summer zenith when you travel down there. It's still, average temperature is -30. It's still plenty cold, but the sun is fairly higher. That means that the greenhouse gases on the tent keeps the temperature inside the tent actually quite warm, t-shirt weather, truly. So it might be 30 or 35 outside, and inside you're literally in your boxers and t-shirt. And you can put solar panel charge on the outside. This keeps your battery charged. When you're in the Arctic environment, and particularly on the Arctic Sea, that typically means you're traveling between February and late April. The sun's much, much low on the zenith. You cannot get a solar charge. That means that you're very, very limited in terms of use of battery. And generally speaking, what I do is I constantly take the battery out. I have a pouch under my arm, close the battery, keep it in the sledge. And every time I have to take a photo, you have to measure the worthiness of taking your mittens off, taking the battery out, taking the camera out, putting in the compartment, taking your photo, taking the battery back out, putting it back, etc., and exposing yourself to cold injuries on your hands, which is invariably the case. So yeah, the equipment takes a beating, especially in the north, because it's humid and cold. So your camera, every night you bring it back into your tent, is literally caught in frost, and it takes a while for it to thaw. And then you sleep with it in your sleeping bag to try and protect the mechanism and the circuit board. It's not without challenges.
Wow. So we have a question from our co-host, Matt Peterson, that I thought would be a good one and get us back towards climate change.
I know that guy.
What would you say to someone who lives in urban, and I add, or rural for that matter, America, for whom the poles feel so distant and remote? Why should they care about the impact of climate change on Antarctica or on the ice around the North Pole?
It's a very good question. Thank you, Matt. Matt is a stellar environmental defendant. He was president and CEO of Global Green, which is an organization founded by President Gorbachev in 1993. And Matt was running and founded the organization for 20 years. I was on the board for about 15. We're old friends. We've been to the Arctic together and elsewhere. Yes, it's a very good question. It's, we certainly have enough problems on our own, right? Who needs other problems like what's going on to penguins and, even just simply to glaciers in Antarctica. And it's hard to convey the notion, which is what science tries so desperately to do, to convey the notion of the interconnectivity of this great chain that we call life, understanding that we're only as strong as the weakest link. And referring once again and riffing a little bit on the bubble that I mentioned earlier about these, convenience of modern life, we're shielded from this concept of this chain because we have this ravenous appetite to want more of everything that we love, right? We don't know that the bluefin tuna is threatened. And if we do, and it's still available on the sushi menu, well, I guess it must not be really that threatened, right? Because it's really delicious. There's a lot of that goes on, and to take it even further, when you're contemplating the bottom line, when you're budgeting your life and life is stressful financially, it's hard to take on more. And it's unfortunate because, of course, regions like Antarctica will be redrawing global maps that this incidence of melting, which has been exponential in Antarctica. Antarctica lost about 76 metric tons of water about 12 years ago, and it's 230 metric tons of water these days and climbing. It doesn't give you a great idea, understand that, but it amounts to about 100 million Olympic-sized swimming pool that pour into the ocean every single day from Antarctica. And by the way, the same essentially from Greenland. That has great consequences on storm surges and of course, the warming of the Antarctic circumpolar current, which is generating a lot of the melt that we're witnessing right now in the Pine Island Glacier. The Pine Island Glaciers, the Pine and the Thwaites, are the sort of ground zero for Antarctica, the first environments on the planet whose degradation has been deemed unstoppable by NASA and a lot of different scientists. Now, I'll tell you this, being very connected to science, typically speaking, scientists don't like to use words like unstoppable for the simple reason that if it does stop, you're the guy who used that vernacular, right? So why use it if you don't have to? But that's what they're saying, it is unstoppable, meaning that the large part of the West Antarctic ice is going to be melting indefinitely. And this is going to have an incidence on everyone from Florida to China to Europe and Holland and many places. All the coastal regions around the world will suffer. So trying to bring this back home is the conundrum of science and climate change. Climate change is time, basically, and it's time stretched. It's starting to compress, but it's time stretched over decadal periods and generational periods. So it's very easy to pass the buck until the next one, as this last administration not just has done, but has increased, the impact against the environment in order to augment the bottom line. And it's a well understood mechanism. Why shouldn't we do it, right? We have access to a certain measure of capital that can be basically brought into our societies and somehow apparently make life better for everyone else, but at what cost? And it's hard to convey that philosophy to people other than to say that everything that you do right now and everything that you hold dear will be impacted by the melt of Antarctica in the same way that it will be impacted by the burning of the Amazon because of this interconnectivity.
Thank you. That was an amazing answer. We need the 2-minute elevator pitch for that as well, Sebastian. So I'm looking through the questions for ones that haven't really been addressed yet. And there's one from Nigel that you talked about it a tiny bit, but he understands, there's a big difference between navigating your way through the Arctic versus Antarctica. And the question is, could you discuss those differences a little bit? We know there's like a mountain range. You have to get over in Antarctica to get to the South Pole. And then in the Arctic, it's all about floating on the ice. Thanks. And then the other one was another question from Luca is, when do you go next back on the ice? And tell us a little bit about the physical preparation for that.
Okay. You see, I had slides of me before and after, but you'll just have to use your imagination. I was just in my underwear, by the way. So, so the difference, yes, in the Arctic and Antarctica. So obviously, in the Arctic, you start at the edge of the continental shelf, and ahead of you is just a body of ice that extends all the way to N90, north 90 degrees latitude, and it's a very, very hyperdynamic environment because there's the transpolar drift, the current that comes from Siberia towards Greenland. It shifts according to winds sometimes, but the dominant current makes that ice always on the move. If you were to stand at the North Pole, within literally seconds, you'll no longer be standing at the North Pole because the North Pole is actually just a point at the bottom of the ocean at 14,600 feet. But what's happening at the top is just basically a cork moving on the ocean. So that dynamic movement makes this ice very challenging to travel because it breaks open, creating open ways of water that we call leads. And then it comes back together with the forces of all this sort of momentum being carried kinetically and connecting, breaking into what we call pressure ridges. These are walls that can be a few feet in height to up to 15 feet that you need to cross, pulling a heavy sledge behind 200 to 400 pounds, depending on the length of your stay. So it's very challenging in that environment. In the Antarctic, it's quite different. You start at sea level going in the opposite direction, meaning that you're going up the glacier until you reach the plateau. And the glacier is an environment that typically is riddled with crevasses. So some of them have bridges over them, so you can see them. Others are invisible. So you need to manifest, somehow where there might be and look at the terrain very carefully and take chances. And it's always unnerving. These crevasses, by the way, particularly in Antarctica, can be literally 200 or 300 feet deep. They can bury a truck. So those are very, very dangerous environments to be in. But once you're on the plateau in Antarctica, it's very, very predictable. There's always a little bit of terrain sort of, adjustments and whatnot, but the winds tend to be relatively predictable as well. They're driven by gravity as well. We call them katabatic winds. They basically come down, gain weight as they get colder and follow a slope where there is one. So you can have a fairly predictable idea where the winds are coming from according to the topography. So those would be the main difference. And there was one other question in these three questions that I forget.
The question was basically, When are you going back next? And
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about preparing, training to go.
Right. So going back next, well, COVID has had a way of, throwing a monkey wrench into everybody's system, mine included. It pulled the curtain on Antarctica for the 2021 season now, essentially. So the best way actually the only way that you can go to Antarctica right now is to get my book, or one of those, or watch it on movies, because no one can actually get to Antarctica. There's one ship with a very limited amount of scientists, the James Ross, I think it's called, who's leaving from Britain. I was hoping, I have a few expeditions. There's one which is a scientific mission about measuring the coldest place on Earth, and that I'm hoping to undertake with my friend Ted Scambos, who's a lead scientist, lead writer with the NSIDC, with the IPCC, that is, who spent years as a lead scientist at the NSIDC, the Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. So we're looking to do that perhaps next winter, and I'm aiming to complete a mission that I failed in 2017, purportedly the last human to walk to the North Pole, if in fact that mission is still possible, given the conditions of the ice, which is melting exponentially. The loss of ice there is really is something else. It's extraordinary how quickly that ice cap is disappearing, and also how quickly we're moving towards 1.5 C, which was the target set by the Paris Agreement. We're now expecting to be there in 2024, so way ahead of predictions. Training, yes, physical training goes without saying. Mass gain, because you'll never be able to eat as much as you're burning on a daily basis. So your body will start to cannibalize itself. So trying to push as much weight as possible. And to me, that generally adds about 15 to 17% mass. So I leave generally at 210 pounds or so, and I'll come back at about 185 or so. So it's a considerable amount of mass loss. Yeah, like that.
Couple of questions here from Jim Herman. Jim and Leilani are in Hawaii, so a little bit far from the ice.
Hey, Leilani.
Jim was the America's consul general in Frankfurt when we were in Berlin. And Frankfurt, by the way, is the largest consulate that we have. So that's a big job and a big responsibility. And he asks, I'd like to ask the one question around one of the great survival stories, Shackleton and the survival of his crew on the Endurance. How has Sebastian's experience in Antarctica changed his understanding of that epic tale? And then, just so we can get a couple of questions going simultaneously, Matt Peterson, I guess, is with your mother. It says, Sebastian's mother and my dear friend Penelope asks in the chat, reaction on John Kerry dealing as ecology chief. It's actually the climate chief under Biden, and what your sense is about that.
Okay, so first question on Shackleton. I mean, look, I'm not God, and Shackleton is God when it comes to expedition. So his experience had been extraordinary. He had been the first he had the farthest south on an expedition the Nimrod expedition that he conducted, and he was forced to turn away because he didn't think, and he was just about 110 miles from the South Pole, and he didn't think he was going to survive, him and his crew. So he famously wrote to his wife, better a live ass than a dead lion, and an ass in this case is meant as a donkey, of course. So look, his mission was extraordinary. He wanted to do the next best thing after Amundsen and Scott in 1911 and 12 completed the mission that he had hoped to complete. And so the next one up for him was a crossing of the continent, which he endeavored to do until his ship was caught in the ice forming in the coastal region of the Ronnie Ice Shelf, and he never actually made it to land. And they were going to winter over, which they attempted to do until the the hull of the ship got crushed by the ice, and they just had two little skiffs and 800 nautical miles to cross to Elephant Island, which was the next area that had some whaling communities, and it was in conditions that are unfathomable. First of all, they wintered over, and they embarked on these skiffs, open skiffs, so no cabin or anything, in the most horrendous conditions of storms and cold and everything else. And extraordinarily, not a single one of his men died, and it took them 18 months to get back, and they did so. And it's truly one of the most extraordinary stories of endurance that there is. So on the second question, of course, John Kerry, who is really a terrific man, somebody that I got to know a little bit. I hosted a fundraiser for his failed bid in 2004 in Los Angeles, and then we co-hosted an event for Barbara Boxer when she was running for to repeat her senatorial position in California. He is a very, very, very legitimate, very authentic, very knowledgeable man to be leading this new position that was created by the Biden administration, a climate envoy. John went to Antarctica. He actually, I was honored that he has my book, wrote me a wonderful handwritten letter when he received it, and spoke about the nature of his concern for Antarctica. This was, by the way, about 10 years ago. So since then, he became Secretary of State, as we all know. I think he signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. I was in Paris at the COP21 at the time, and he is he's a very legit guy, and certainly it sends, I think, a very, very positive signal to the international community and to the environmental community that America's back, and it means business when it comes to climate.
Thank you so much. We agree, and
I'm sure you guys do. Yeah.
So, I'm looking at the time. There's only 5 minutes left, and I wanted to give you, so we have a ton of really good questions that are in the Q&A that we're not going to be able to get to, but I have a question to Chevaliers, which is, can you possibly cut and paste those questions to Sebastian so he can individually respond to those people who weren't able to get their questions answered? There's really good ones. And so if we can do that, then at least, you can get your questions answered. I'm sure everybody would love to hear the answers, but I wanted to see if there's anything that hasn't been asked that you said, wow, you know what, I would really want to make sure I make this point or tell this story before the end, and before we wrap.
I think there is something. I think it's quite interesting. So the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58 led to an incredible consensus among nations and among scientists that generated the Antarctic Treaty, which was signed, which was created in 1959, signed into fact in 1961, and then was ratified in Madrid in 1991, and essentially defined Antarctica a land of research, land of peace, and land of science. What's really interesting about the treaty, which was signed in 61, it came into force in 61, in July of 61, which was essentially just a few months before the Bay of Pigs. So a time where, admittedly, geopolitics were at an all-time high in terms of conflict and danger. What with nuclear weapons being ready on the go and whatnot, and yet internationally we came together, and scientifically scientists came together to generate a treaty to protect this very pristine environment, which is the Antarctic. And the story that I would like to tell, and hopefully I'll have time for it, but in parallel to this, and to illustrate the conflict that was going on at the time, the Russians, who were jealous to a large extent of the control the US had of the South Pole Station, the Scott Amundsen Station, that's controlled by the National Science Foundation in the US and administered by the US. The Russian wanted to claim an area in Antarctica that would be their own. And so they asked their scientists, where could we essentially put the Russian flag and generate our own control of a seminal spot on Antarctica. And so in 1957, they took off for what scientists had told them would be the spot, which is the pole of inaccessibility. And the pole of inaccessibility, the Antarctic pole of inaccessibility, essentially is the farthest point from coasts and the most remote and, allegedly the most difficult of access on Antarctica. Now, to be fair, there are poles of inaccessibilities everywhere around the world. It just means the farthest point from the shore, whether you're in the middle of the ocean or the middle of the continent. In Antarctica, the POI is a very remote spot. And so in 1957, they sent an expedition of tractors that traveled about 1,300 kilometers and reached there in December. And they built a station there, and they installed, radio towers and did some studies and whatnot. And then eventually, because it's very cold there, it's at 12,200 feet in elevation. The average temperature year round is minus 78. This is without wind chill, so it's a very, very cold environment. And after 2 weeks, they basically said, listen, this is excuse my French, but it's a frozen shithole. We're, getting out of here. It's just too cold, and and that's it. So they left, but before leaving, they fixed a bust of Lenin on top of the chimney, which was about 15 feet above, and they left. And so I went there, that was one of the stops on my one cross-continental journey in Antarctica. And I reached there. We were only the fourth team in history to reach there, and the first to do so unsupported from land and as part of a cross-continental crossing. And the bust of Lenin was still there, still facing Moscow, except that there's only about 4 feet left of the station, which is buried about 10 feet below the surface. And so this was an interesting story, that this parallel, that there was still this big tension going on with Antarctica, with the Cold War, the onset of the Cold War and whatnot. And yet that geophysicists and scientists from around the world during the International Geoscience Year managed to all come together to create this treaty. And I think that this is a great, powerful lesson, because probably, in my opinion, in terms of science and politics, that was our finest hour. And I hope, given the scope of the risks that we're facing, this incredible mammoth problem that we're, this freight train that's coming at us in slow motion, but is a real problem. I just hope that we can once again come together as we did in that year in 1959, and that with America back on track, led by by Secretary Kerry and President-elect Biden, that we can set our differences aside, at least when it comes to climate, because this is a problem that concerns us all.
One thing I just want to note is that we've been joined by Ed Begley, who has probably done more than anyone back when, 20 years ago, to start us being conscious about these issues and how to live our lives in a way that'll help to reduce pressure on the environment. So just so happy to have Ed with us today.
So
the gold standard.
Yeah.
A good friend.
We're past the hour. I think we could basically all stay here and talk with you for at least another hour, Sebastian. It's such an important and interesting topic, and I want to thank everybody. And, part of me says, gee, I wanted to say, the next time we do this, let's all meet in person and do it. But I do think that one of the advantages of all of us being on having this technology is allowing us to gather so many different people from around the world together, who all care about this and think it's super, super important, the work you're doing. So please keep bringing this to our attention, keep going on your journeys, and everybody please support what Sebastian is doing by getting many copies of his book. Great Christmas present, great holiday gift. And Sebastian, thank you again. Thank you so much. And Chevaliers, thank you for hosting this. And we'll look forward to seeing you at some point in the next year.
John and Kim, I can't thank you enough. You know, again, my deepest apologies for being decidedly so low take. You know,
that's okay. We have a great follow-up.
it was not meant to be, but it was nonetheless, there's so much to say on the topic, and speaking with you guys is always such a pleasure. So come back again, and let's hang out again in Munich soon, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Oktoberfest or before. Take care.
Okay. Thank you to all of you. Thanks for being with us. Yeah.
Great.
Take care.
We'll get you those questions and we'll send everything out to everybody so they can see the incredible trailer.
And thank you to the co-hosts as well, Matt and my beautiful wife,
Yeah.
Carol.
Absolutely.
Hi, Carolyn, wherever you are.
Cheers.
Bye, Matt.
Bye, guys.
Bye.